God-given prophecy is history in advance. Church history is his story of Jesus building his church in the world from his place seated at the right hand of the Father in providence. The History of Protestantism by James A. Wiley is perhaps one of the most complete chronicles of that history. Thank you for joining me. We will continue right where we left off last time. Chapter 20. Calvin's victory over the Libertines. Another arena. Excommunication. Council grasps the ecclesiastical power. Berthelier excommunicated. Spiritual sentence annulled by the Senate. The Libertines make common cause with Servetus. New indictment against Servetus. Calvin fighting two battles at the same time. Communion Sunday. Consistory's remonstrance with the council. The council changes nothing in its decree. Sunday, September 3rd, 1553. A momentous issue to be determined. The communion table in St. Peter's. The Libertines approach. Calvin debars them. The Reformation saved. Moral grandeur of the act. The two beacons. Worms a triumph over tyrannical power. St. Peter's a triumph over godless democracy. Leaving Servetus in prison, let us repair to another arena of combat. It is another, and yet the same, for the affair of Servetus has entered the sphere of Genevan politics and awakened into fresh intensity the slumbering conflict between the two parties that divide the Republic. Perrin was laboring to undermine, step by step, the power of Calvin. The pastors had been expelled from the Council General, the assembly of the whole people. There followed a more direct attack on the ecclesiastical authority. It was proposed to transfer the power of excommunication from the consistory to the Senate. This was to strike a fatal blow at the principle on which Calvin had based the reformation of the state. Should this principle be overturned, his work in Geneva would be at an end, and he might leave it the next hour, so far as any good purpose was to be served by remaining in it. The consistory stripped of all independent jurisdiction, moral order would fall, and those halcyon days would return when men could go to the tavern at all hours of the day and night, drink as deep as they had in mind, and disport themselves in dances like those in which the pagans of old honored the god Bacchus. About a year and a half before this, Philip Berthelier had been debarred the communion table by the consistory. Philip was the son of that Berthelier who in 1521 had spilled his blood for the liberty of the fatherland. As the father had ennobled the state by his virtues, the son thought he had a right to disgrace it with his vices. He was, says Bayle, a bad liver. He submitted quietly to the excommunication of the consistory for a year and a half, but now, deeming the moment opportune, inasmuch as the tide was running against the reformer and his policy, he appeared before the council and demanded that it should annul the sentence of the spiritual court, and so restore him to communion with the church. The reformer hastened to the council and warned it of the fatal consequences of complying with Berthelier's request. He urged strongly that the edicts of the Republic gave the council no power concerning excommunication, and that to bind and loose ecclesiastically was to effect a revolution. The reformer's remonstrance was disregarded. The council released Berthelier from the spiritual sentence and opened his way to the communion table. The axe was laid at the root of the ecclesiastical discipline, and the days of the Genevan Republic were, to all appearance, numbered. From the council chamber, where the fatal measure in which the Libertines saw the approaching downfall of the spiritual authority had been passed, Calvin hurried to the prison, where he and his colleagues were to be confronted with Servetus. This day, 1st of September, 1553, it was resolved by the council that the oral debates between the prisoner and the pastors should be dropped, and that the discussion should henceforward be carried on in writing. This change was supported by Perrin and Berthelier, who were there, flushed with the victory of the morning. The proposal, made in the interest of Servetus, who was supposed to be more eloquent with his pen than with his voice, was adopted, and it brought with it a marked change in his demeanor, which Riley thus describes. What demonstrates with the clearest evidence the hope which the prisoner placed in the power of his protectors is the language from which that time he adopted, and the open, furious, mortal work which he waged against the reformer, now become the object of his direct attacks. Servetus threw himself, with all the ardor of a man well nigh sure of victory, into a path where, by his own confession, he wished to pursue his opponent, even till the cause be terminated by the death of him or me. At the same meeting of council, Calvin was ordered to draw up anew articles of indictment from the works of Servetus in the form of plain statements, without any reasoning for or against. The crisis which had arisen in the matter of the ecclesiastical discipline might well, one should think, have engrossed all the reformer's thoughts, but he gave himself, with his might, to this new labor. He reproduced from the works of the prisoner 38 propositions, and appending neither note nor comment, and giving simply references to the text, he handed them to the council. This done, he turned his thoughts to the graver matter that weighed upon him. The resolution of the council touching excommunication was simply a breaking into pieces of the lever with which he hoped to elevate the republic. The reformer must fight two battles at the same time. Time pressed. The day after the morrow was the first Sunday of September, when, according to a custom universal in the French Reformed churches, the communion was to be celebrated, and unless the edict were revoked, Berthelier would then present himself at the sacred table with the warrant of the council in his hand. The reformer, without a moment's delay, assembled all the pastors, alike of town and country, and putting himself at their head, proceeded to the great council. He showed, with characteristic energy, the brink to which the decision of the little council had brought the republic, that decision was a manifest violation of both the laws of the state and the rules of Scripture, and that if persisted in it, would sweep away all that had been done during the past 10 years for the reformation of manners, and render hopeless all efforts in the future. In short, it was a revolution. The whole people, he said, had with uplifted hands adopted the edict establishing the spiritual power in the spiritual court, and he would rather die than tolerate, contrary to his conscience, an excommunicated man at the sacred table. In this protest the pastors to a man joined, all declaring that rather to suffer the contemplated profanation, they would lay down their offices and leave their churches. The council answered that it changed nothing in its decree. In taking into its own hands the spiritual authority, the council, it might be unwittingly, assumed the right of trying and adjudging Servetus. It said to the consistory, "Stand aside. You are dissolved as a court of having jurisdiction. We assume the function and responsibility of giving judgment on all persons and causes, civil and spiritual." To Perrin and the Libertines, victory was following on victory. The coming day, they hoped, would crown this series of successes. Whichever way Calvin might turn, he would, they were sure, encounter defeat. If he should obey the edict of the council, he would be disgraced before the people. If he should disobey it, he would rebel against the magistrate. Either way, his power was at an end. They had not yet taken the true measure of the reformer, or rather, they had not yet learned how much better is a little wisdom than great cunning. By the simple strategy of going right forward, the reformer broke all the toils the libertines had woven round him, and swept away alike the victories they had already won, and those which they made themselves sure of winning in the future. Sunday morning, the 3rd of September, dawned. No more eventful day had for centuries risen over Geneva, or indeed over Christendom. This day it was to be seen whether Protestantism, which had retreated within its last stronghold, would recruit its powers and reorganize its forces, and from hence go forth to reconquer Christendom, or whether it would relinquish the battle as beyond its strength. Twice already the great Protestant movement, after giving promise of emancipating the world, had failed. First the Albigensian revival, next the Bohemian uprising, overborne by violence, and disappointed the hopes they had inspired. Was this the third movement which had come nearer the goal than either of the two preceding ones? After all, to fall short of it, and leave the world still under the dominion of darkness? The moment was the most critical that had occurred since Luther's appearance at the Diet of Worms. In Germany, the Reformed phalanx was demoralized, thanks to the sword, and yet more to the interim of Charles. France, under Henry II, was blazing with martyr piles. With Mary in England had come a fiercer tempest of persecution than that country had ever before known. Where now, alas? We hear Calvin pathetically exclaim, where now are Kramer and Ridley, and John à Lasco, and the hundreds of others in England which the Reformation numbered aforetime amongst its children? Some of them, leaving their bodies to the flames, had mounted on high, and were now living with God. Others, crossing seas and mountains, had found a home in foreign lands. On every side, up to the limits of the Genevan territory, the Reformation was pursued by the tyrant and the inquisitor, and even here, if the sword was still restrained, new and hideous foes had risen to assail the gospel. The abyss of atheistic pantheism had suddenly opened, and a monstrous birth had come up out of it, which sought to strangle the infant Reformation, where the Hydra sought to strangle the infant Hercules in its cradle. Such were the portents that deformed the time. The customary hour of public worship was now come. The great bell Clemens tolled out its summons. The throng of worshippers on their way to the cathedral had rolled past, and now the streets, which had resounded with their tread, were emptied and silent. Over city, plain, and lake there brooded a deep stillness. It was around the pulpit of St. Peter's, and the man with pale face, commanding eye, and kingly brow who occupied it, that the heart of Geneva palpitated. The church was filled with an uneasy crowd. On the benches of the consistory sat, unmoved, the pastors and elders, resolved to bear the greatest violence rather than not do their duty. A confused noise was heard within the temple. The congregation opened with difficulty, and a numerous band of men, of all ranks, their hands upon their sword hilts, forced their way in presence of the holy table. The elite of the Libertines had decided to communicate. Berthelier did not appear as yet. He reserved himself till the last moment. Calvin, calm as ever, rose to begin the service. He could not but see the group of Libertines in the vast congregation before him, but he seemed to be as if he saw them not. He preached on the state of mind which the Lord's Supper ought to be received. At the close, raising his voice, he said, "As for me, so long as God shall leave me here, since he hath given me fortitude, and I have received it from him, I will employ it, whatever betide, and I will guide myself by my Master's rule, which is to me clear and well known. As we are now about to receive the Holy Supper of our Lord Jesus Christ, if anyone who has been debarred by the consistory shall approach this table, though it should cost my life, I will show myself such as I ought to be. When the liturgies were concluded, Calvin came down from the pulpit and took his stand before the table. Lifting up the white napkin, he displayed the symbols of Christ's body and blood, the food destined for believing souls. Having blessed the bread and wine, he was about to distribute them to the congregation. At that moment there was seen a movement among the Libertines as if they would seize the bread and the cup. The Reformer, covering the sacred symbols with his hands, exclaimed in a voice that rang through the edifice, "These hands you may crush, these arms you may lop off, my life you may take, my blood is yours, you may shed it, but you shall never force me to give holy things to the profane, and dishonor the table of my God." These words broke like a thunder peal over the Libertines, as if an invisible power had flung back the ungodly host. They slunk away abashed, the congregation opening a passage for their retreat. A deep calm succeeded, and the sacred ordinance, says Beza, was celebrated with a profound silence, and under a solemn awe in all present, as if the deity himself had been visible among them. Other than the transaction we have just narrated, we know nothing more truly sublime in the whole history of the Reformation, that epic of heroic men and grand events. The only thing we can compare with it is Luther's appearance at the Diet of Worms. If we abstract the dramatic accompaniments of the latter scene, the gorgeous hall, the majesty of the emperor, the blaze of princely and knightly rank gathered round him, the glitter of stars and decorations, the men-at-arms, the lackeys and other attendants, and look only at the principle at stake, and the wide and lasting good achieved by the prompt vindication of that principle, the act of Calvin in the Cathedral of St. Peter's in 1553 stands side by side, its equal in spiritual sublimity and heroism, with the act of Luther in the Hall of Worms in 1521. "I cannot," said Luther. "I will not," said Calvin. The one repelled the tyrant, the other flung back the mob. The one stemmed the haughtiness of power, the other bridled the raging fury of ungodliness. In both the danger was equal. In both the faith and fortitude were equal, and each saved the Reformation at a great crisis. These two acts, Luther at Worms and Calvin in St. Peter's, were in fact two beacon lights kindled by Providence for the instruction of Europe. They were hung out at the opening of a new epoch, to enable Christendom to pilot itself past two tremendous dangers that lay right in its course. The one of these dangers was only beginning to be visible. The conflict waged in St. Peter's on Sunday, the 3rd of September 1553, showed how that danger was to be avoided. A Protestant church, scripturally constituted and faithfully governed, was the only possible breakwater against that lawless pantheism which was even then lifting up its head and threatening society with ruin. Such was the lesson taught by the heroic act in St. Peter's. Calvin was the first man against whom the foul and furious tide of communism dashed itself. It broke against the pulpit of St. Peter's before it precipitated itself upon the throne of France. It has since, with swelling and triumphant crest, overwhelmed parliaments and dynasties, laid prostrate thrones and devastated kingdoms. But in contemplating these dismal tragedies, it becomes us to call to mind that the Reformer of Geneva confronted this communism 300 years ago, that he confronted it single-handed and conquered it, Had the principle of Protestantism been rooted and grounded in every parish in France, yielding the same spiritual fruits as they did at Geneva, how different would have been the history of a people to whom nature has given a genius so manifold that it would have shown equally in the beauty of their arts and in the grace and brilliancy of their literature, in the valor of their arms, and the equity of their jurisprudence, in the purity of their homes, and in the freedom and stability of their public institutions. But, continuing under the malign power of a corrupted and corrupting faith, this race, so richly endowed, has had its great qualities transformed into headlong passions which have entailed upon country and throne 3 centuries of calamities and woes. Chapter 21. Apprehension and Trial of Servetus. Here I stand, etc. Calvin expects to be banished. Takes farewell of his flock. Servetus. Resume. Servetus asked to dispute with Calvin. The magistrates refuse. Nicholas de la Fontaine enters himself as prosecutor for Calvin. Examination of Servetus. Defended by Berthelier. Calvin comes forward. The council take the prosecution into their own hands. Indictment of the Attorney General. Sedition, the main charge against Servetus. Servetus pleads for free inquiry. His cause mixed up with the Libertines. Boldness of Servetus. Calvin's struggle with the council. Shall the reformer quit Geneva? His influence with the magistrates at 0. It seemed, indeed, a small matter whether Calvin should give the sacrament to Berthelier or withhold it, but the question, in another form, as Calvin clearly saw, was whether he should maintain the Reformation or abandon it. The moment he should put the consecrated elements into the hands of the libertine, that moment he would lay the spiritual prerogative at the feet of the civil power, and Geneva would fall as the bulwark of Protestantism. To Berthelier, therefore, with the edict of the council in his hand, and his libertine hordes at his back, Calvin said, "No. It was the here I stand, I cannot do otherwise. So help me God," repeated over again, at the moment equally critical, and in the face of a danger equally great. The reformer had escaped the greater danger, even death, which the libertines hinted would be the penalty of refusal, but exile still hung over him. In the evening of the same Sunday he ascended the pulpit to take farewell of the flock from which he expected the coming day would see him parted, probably forever. He chose as the subject of his discourse Paul's farewell address to the elders of the church of Ephesus, and the scene witnessed that night on the banks of the Leman was almost as touching as that enacted 15 centuries before on the shores of the Aegean. Closing his sermon and spreading out his hands over his loving flock, for the last time, as he believed, he said, "I commend you to God and to the word of his grace." The words were mingled with the sobs and tears of those to whom they were spoken. But no order of banishment came on the morrow, though he waited hour after hour for it. The reformer perceived that, so far, the victory remained with him. Left undisturbed, he turned his thought to the other matter which was then engrossing him. For he was grappling with 2 foes at once. We shall now turn with him to this, in every view of it, sad affair. In order to an accurate idea of the trial, and of the various interests that combined to guide it to its deplorable issue, we must briefly review the steps already taken. On the 3rd of August, Calvin, having learned that Servetus was in Geneva, demanded his arrest. But Geneva law required the accuser to go to prison along with the accused till he had shown a reasonable grounds for his accusation. Nicholas de la Fontaine, the secretary of Calvin, gave himself up in the stead of the reformer. Next day, a complaint in 38 articles drawn up, as we have said, by Calvin, was presented against Servetus. On the morrow, the council assembled in the criminal audience chamber in the prison, and Servetus, having been interrogated on the articles, demanded a public disputation, promising to confute Calvin from Scripture and the Fathers. The prisoner further urged that it did not become a civil court to adjudicate on such matters. Here was a door opened for the council to escape responsibility it had chosen. But, says Riley, the magistrates refused to entertain the proposal, though Calvin, for his part, agreed, and protested that, as far as regarded him, there was nothing that he more desired than to lead such a cause in the temple before all the people. Why, we ask, this refusal on the part of the magistrates? Riley answers, the council feared, no doubt, that it would thus dispose itself of the cognizance of an affair which stood connected with the prerogatives of which it had recently appeared so jealous. That is, the council was then struggling to shut out the consistory and to secure to itself the spiritual as well as the civil government of Geneva. The preliminary examination of Servetus ended. The council, having regarded to his replies, found that the charges were true, and accordingly Nicholas de la Fontaine was discharged from prison, under obligation to appear as often as he might be called and to prosecute his case. The council, in coming to the conclusion that Servetus was guilty, appeared to have been influenced less by his opinions on the Trinity than by his views on baptism. The frightful excesses of the Anabaptists in Germany and Switzerland, which were fresh in their memory, made the council, doubtless, view this as the most dangerous part of his creed. Tomorrow, August 16th, when the council assembled to prosecute the affair, two new parties appeared on the arena. These were Philibert Berthelier, the Libertine opponent of Calvin, and M. Germain Colladon, a Protestant refugee, and a man learned in the law. Colladon was associated with Fontaine in the defense and prosecution. The two, Berthelier and Colladon, were representatives of the two parties into which Geneva was divided, and their appearance indicated that the affair was tending to wider issues than any personal to Servetus. In short, it was becoming the battleground on which the question was to be determined whether Libertine pantheism or the Protestant faith should hold possession of Geneva. Such is the indifference of Riley, who says, each of the antagonists saw behind the proceedings carried on in the bishop's palace the interests of the parties who disputed for Geneva. It appears from the minutes that, at this meeting of council, Berthelier undertook the defense of Servetus, and strongly argued in favor of his peculiar doctrines as well as of himself. Colladon attacked with equal ardor both the errors and their author. The violence of the debate extended itself to the council, and the sitting, which was a stormy one, was abruptly terminated. The scene brought forward a more powerful man than any who had hitherto appeared in the prosecution. Berthelier was at that moment under excommunication by the consistory, and he had a petition lying on the table of the council to have the sentence of the spiritual court cancelled. It was thus tolerably plain that his championship of Servetus was inspired not so much by the wish to defend the prisoner as by his desire to overthrow the consistory. Calvin felt, says Riley, that the moment had arrived for him to appear, and boldly to resist the hostilities against himself of which Servetus was about to become the occasion, if he would not see his whole work in Geneva swept away. Accordingly, the very next day, he declared that he would appear as accuser. The reformer was now invited by the council to assist, in order that his errors might be better demonstrated, and to have whomsoever he chose with him at the examinations of the prisoner. At the first meeting after this, at which Calvin was present, a sharp debate took place between him and Servetus. The issue was that the council found that the charges contained in the indictment were proven from the books given in evidence and the prisoner's own confessions. Fontaine had previously been discharged from prison. Now he was released from his obligation to prosecute, and the affair was taken entirely into the hands of the Attorney General. The second act of the trial opened on the 21st of August. Their Excellencies in Council, assembled, resolved as follows: inasmuch as the case of heresy of M. Servetus vitally affects the welfare of Christendom, it is resolved to proceed with his trial. At this sitting, Calvin and the ministers, his colleagues, were introduced by the Attorney General. They were wanted to give their evidence as to the meaning of the word person, as used in certain passages of the Fathers. Servetus taught that the person of the Son of God had no existence prior to the Incarnation. He held that Christ existed from all eternity only as an idea, not as a person, in the essence or bosom of God, and that the term Son of God is applied in Scripture to Christ Jesus as a man. He cited passages from Tertullian, Irenaeus, and Clement, favorable, as he thought, to his opinion, and it was to give judgment on Servetus's interpretation of these passages that the pastors were now summoned. The service asked of them they rendered. At the meeting on the 23rd, the Attorney General produced a new indictment against Servetus. It differed considerably from that which Fontaine had given in when the prisoner was first arrested, and which had been drawn up by Calvin. This new indictment dropped the theological errors of Servetus out of view altogether, well nigh, and gave marked prominence to his offenses against society. Its title ran thus: "These are the interrogations and articles upon which the Attorney General of the city desires to question Michael Servetus, a prisoner guilty of blasphemies, of heresies, and of disturbing Christendom." If Servetus had in the eyes of Genevese justice, says Relier, no other fault than that which de la Fontaine had declared him guilty in regard to Calvin, his acquittal had been sure. If Calvin alone, he continues, had been concerned in the affair of Servetus, all his efforts would have been unavailing to secure the condemnation of his adversary. Servetus was tried, says he again, and, as we shall mention below, condemned by the majority of his judges, not at all as the opponent of Calvin, scarcely a heretic, but essentially as seditious. Politics acted a much more important part than theology toward the close of the trial. They came on the stage with the Attorney General. Servetus saw the new position in which he stood and strove to defend himself against the charges of the Attorney General, not by denying that his opinions were theologically false, but by trying to show that they were not socially dangerous. This defense he followed up with a petition to the magistrates, in which he labored to convince them that his opinions at the worst were only speculative errors, and not practical seditions, and, adds Relier, he had been able to make it appear that they were divested of all practical results. The issue of his trial make it appear they were divested of all practical results, the issue of his trial would not have been fatal. There came, at this stage of the business, a series of discussions on points which we cannot help thinking were irrelevant. Servetus was interrogated respecting his persistency in publishing his opinions, seeing he knew they were condemned by ancient councils and imperial decrees, and the evil he had done or wished to do society by maintaining them. He replied, with ability and apparent frankness that believing it to be the truth, which he held, he would have offended God if he had not published it. That the ecclesiastical edicts and imperial decrees, which menaced him with death for these opinions, dated from a period when the Church had become more or less corrupt, and that the Church in apostolic times knew no such edicts, nor approved the doctrine of repelling opinion by force. These were truths, and the only mistake about them, to Servetus a very serious one, was that they came 3 centuries too soon, and were addressed to judges who were incapable of feeling their force. But when the prisoner affirmed that he had hardly ever spoken to anyone on his peculiar opinions, he stated what was impossible to reconcile with the known fact of his 20 years' active diffusion of his sentiments in Germany and France. This was the very week in which the struggle between Calvin and the Libertines came to a crisis. The authority, and it might be the life of the reformer, hung upon the issue of that contest. Servetus from his prison watched the ebb and flow of the battle, and was humble and bold by turns, as victory appeared to incline now to give Calvin, and now to the Libertines. The approaching Sunday was that of the September Communion, and Berthelier, as we have seen, held an order from the council authorizing him to appear at the Holy Table. This seemed the death warrant of Calvin's power. We can trace the influence of this turn of affairs upon Servetus. The council had ordered Calvin to extract from his works and present without note or comment those propositions in them which he deemed false. In obedience to the order, the reformer drew up 38 articles, which were given to the prisoner to be answered by him. But Servetus's reply bore the character of a bitter attack upon the reformer, rather than that of a defense of himself. "Wretch," said he, apostrophizing Calvin, "do you think to stun the ears of the judges by your barking? You have confused intellect, so that you cannot understand the truth. Perverted by Simon Magus, you are ignorant of the first principles of things. You make men only blocks and stones by establishing the slavery of the will." To write thus, within the walls of a prison, was to be very sure of victory. Nay, Servetus, looking upon Calvin as already fallen, no longer has recourse to subterfuges. He no longer seeks to show that his doctrines are innocuous. Throwing aside the veil, he openly avows that he held the opinions imputed to him in his indictment. He had drawn up his self-accusation with his own hand. Calvin instantly wrote an answer to the paper of Servetus, as the council had required. His strong hand thrust back the unhappy man into his former position. Injurious words against Servetus, says Relier, are not spared, but these were coined so current in the days that, instead of being deemed excessive, they fell from the pen without observation. The reformer's answer was given to the judge, signed by all the ministers of the Church of Geneva, 14 in number. No sooner has Calvin laid down the pen than, seeing his own position and work are at the moment trembling in the balance, he turns to the other and graver conflict. On Saturday, the 2nd of September, he appeared before the little council to demand the cancelling of the warrant given to Berthelier to receive the Lord's Supper. The council declined to comply. It retained in its own hands the power to admit or to exclude whomsoever it would from the communion table. It stripped Calvin and the consistory of all ecclesiastical authority and power, and, of course, of all responsibility for censures and punishments of an ecclesiastical kind. This power the council took solely upon itself. The use made of it will afterwards appear. The scene that took place in the Cathedral of St. Peter the very next day we have already narrated, but the reformer did not account it enough that he refused to obey in the matter, which the laws of the state gave no right to the council to command, he resolved, although at the risk of his life, to maintain the battle and reconquer the lost prerogative, without which he would not remain in Geneva. On the 7th of September, Calvin and his colleagues went to the little council with the text of the ecclesiastical ordinances, and appealing to the letter of the law, he showed the council that the ordinances gave it no power concerning excommunication, and that what it had done was a subversion of the Constitution of Geneva. He further craved the council to make known its final determination upon the point, that he and his colleagues might be able to regulate their conduct as regarded resigning or retaining their functions in Geneva. The council took 3 days to consider the matter, and, adds the Register, it commanded that meanwhile John Calvin must preach and do his duty. On the 18th of September, the council passed a resolution declaring that it would adhere to the edicts as it had hitherto done. This reply, in point of ambiguity, was almost Delphic. Interpreted by recent acts, it meant that the council saw nothing inconsistent with the edicts in what they had done, and would still retain in their own hands the ecclesiastical government. Still, the reformer did not view it as justifying him in abandoning his work in Geneva, and Farel and other friends wrote at this crisis earnestly beseeching him not to quit his post. Meanwhile, Servetus was busy in his prison with his annotations on Calvin's reply. The unhappy man, believing that his friends, the Libertines, who communicated with him through the gaoler, were on the eve of triumphing, and that the reformer was as good as fallen, was no longer at pains to conceal his intense hatred of the latter. Writing between the lines and on the margin of Calvin's document, he expressed himself in the following melancholy terms: "You howl like a blind man in the desert places, because the spirit of vengeance burns in your heart. You lie, you lie, you lie, you ignorant calumniator." There followed a good deal more in the same vein. The reformer was shown the writing, but leaving to Servetus the last word, he deigned no reply. At this stage of the affair, the magistrates of Geneva resolved, on the 19th of September, to consult the Helvetic churches. Servetus had expressed a wish to that effect. A messenger of state, Jacques Mose Journos, was dispatched on the 21st to the churches of Bern, Zurich, Schaffhausen, and Basel. He carried letters to the magistrates as well as to the pastors of the 4 cities, as also the requisite documents, namely, the articles of accusation, the papers exchanged between Servetus and Calvin, and a copy of the Christianismi Restituto. From this moment, Calvin quits the scene. The course of the affair was precisely what it would have been, although he had not been in Geneva at all. His influence with the council was then at 0. We think we can see the end served thereby, though Calvin could not. To him it was only mortifying, as betokening impending overthrow of the Reformation in Geneva. Writing to Bullinger at Zurich on the 7th of September, he says, "Were I to declare that it is day at high noon, they, the council, would immediately begin to doubt it." That is all which he could put on paper, but he adds, "Our brother Walter, the son-in-law of Bullinger, will tell you more." This shows that the idea entertained by some that the reformer was at that time all-powerful with the council, and that he dictated the sentence it was to pronounce, is an entire misapprehension. Chapter 22. Condemnation and Death of Servetus. The Swiss churches consulted. Servetus demands Calvin's impeachment. Answer of the Swiss churches. Their verdict unanimous. Council condemns Servetus to be burned. Calvin intercedes that the sword be substituted for the stake. Sentence communicated to Servetus. Farewell. Interview between Servetus and Calvin. Servetus summoned to execution. His terror. The procession. View from Champel. Farrell's last conversation with Servetus. The pile kindled. Servetus dies. Gibbon. Jurisprudence of the age. No Romanist can condemn Calvin. In the resolution to which the magistrates of Geneva had come, to lay the affair of Servetus before the Swiss Reformed churches, we see the churches of Helvetia formed into a jury, pending the verdict, which it would seem Servetus did not for a moment doubt would be entirely in his favor. The accused took another step against Calvin. From his prison on the 22nd of September, he sent to the council a list of articles on which M. Servetus wishes J. Calvin to be interrogated. He there accuses Calvin of having falsely imputed to him the opinion that the soul is mortal. If I have said that, not merely said it, but publicly written it, to infect the world, I would condemn myself to death. Wherefore, my lords, I demand that my false accuser be punished, and that he be detained a prisoner like me, till the cause be decided for his death or mine or other punishment. Servetus had formerly declined the civil jurisdiction in matters theological. He now, in the hope of placing the reformer in the same hazard as himself, accepts that jurisdiction in those very matters in which he had before declined it. And further, he makes it plain that he was not more liberal than his age, in holding that a conviction for heresy ought to draw after it the punishment of death. Meanwhile, the state messenger was making a circuit of the 4 cities, sojourning long enough in each to permit the magistrates and pastors to consider the documents and make up their minds. At the end of nearly a month, the messenger returned. The answers of the cities and pastors were given to the council, and on the 18th of October, they were 8 in all, there being a deliverance from the government and a deliverance from the church in each case. The verdict 8 times pronounced, with awful unanimity, was death. Thus, outside the territory of Geneva, was the fate of Servetus decided. About the same time that the suffrages of the Swiss churches were given, an officer arrived at Geneva from the tribunal of Vienna. This man carried an order from his masters empowering him to demand the surrender of the prisoner and bring him to Vienna, that he might undergo the sentence that had been passed upon him. Their lordships of Geneva replied that it was not their custom to give up one charged with a crime till he had been either acquitted or condemned. However, confronting Servetus with the Viennese officer, they asked him whether he would remain with them or go back to the person who had come to fetch him. The unhappy man, with tears in his eyes, replied, "Messieurs of Geneva, judge me according to your good pleasure, but do not send me back with the hangman." This interference of the Roman Catholic authorities of Vienna hastened the fate of the prisoner. The Council of Geneva assembled on the 26th of October to give judgment. The discussion was a stormy one. Perrin and the Libertines fought hard to save the accused, but the preponderating majority felt that the case could have but one issue. Servetus had already been condemned by the Popish tribunal of Vienna. The tribunal of the Swiss Reform had unanimously condemned him. The codes of Theodosius and Justinian, which still formed the basis of the criminal jurisprudence of Geneva, condemned him. And the universal opinion of Christendom, Popish and Protestant, held him to be worthy of death. To these considerations was added the horror of his sentiments had inspired in all minds, not only did his opinions outrage the fundamental doctrines of the then common creed of Christendom, they assailed with atrocious blasphemy the persons of the Trinity, and they tore up, in their last consequences, the roots of society, by striking down conscience within man, and the power of law without him. What day the council acquitted Servetus, it pronounced the dissolution of the state, political and religious, and opened the floodgates on Christendom of those horrible impieties and massacring crusades which had already inflicted fearful havoc in many of the provinces of Germany. Europe, they believed, would not hold them guiltless if they let loose this plague a second time. Therefore, without consulting Calvin, without even thinking of him, and viewing the questions as a social rather than a theological one, and dealing with it as a sedition rather than heresy, for, says Relier, the principles of order, as then understood, did not permit them longer to hesitate as to whether or not they should see in them, i.e., the opinions of Servetus, the crime of treason against society. The magistrates of Geneva closed their diet of the 26th of October with a decree condemning Servetus to death. Let him, so ran the decree of the council, as inscribed in the registers, be condemned to be led to Champel, and there burned alive, and let him be executed tomorrow, and his books consumed. We record with horror the sentence, but it is the sentence not of the magistrates of Geneva only, nor of the magistrates and pastors of Reformed Switzerland only. It is the sentence of Christendom of that age. For the Inquisition on the one side, and Melanchthon on the other, are heard expressing their concurrence in it. At this supreme hour, one man alone comes forward to attempt a mitigation of the punishment of Servetus. Who is that man? He is John Calvin. He earnestly interceded with the council, not that the unfortunate victim might be spared, but that the sword might be substituted for the fire. But he interceded in vain. It is to him, notwithstanding, says Relier, that men have always imputed the guilt of that funeral pile, which he wished had never been reared. I wish to express a special thanks to all the supporters of First Amendment Radio and our mission on true prophecy reformation. If you would like to support the work here with a special one-time gift, it would be greatly appreciated. We, however, always prefer an ongoing, faithful gift of support for the labor that continues here always. So please consider carefully how much you are able to continue without undue hardship to your own household. In the least, please like and share and subscribe wherever you are receiving this work. Thank you.